Welcome to Sustainable Community Rural Community Food System. I guess this is our sixth meeting. To plow ahead one step further in terms of what it is we think we understand. Before we get started, anyone have any specific aspects of this that they'd like to cover today? In addition to education and shift value system.
Yeah, I think shift value system we haven't really addressed yet. It seems to me you're cutting right to it here, but the model is pretty solid now in showing relationships and connections here. But the one core lever and element in my mind is the value system, which requires its own explanation, connections. You know, how does it come? How does it change?
Okay.
It's the core lever of the entire system.
If it's the core effort of the entire system, why is it hanging way out here on the edge?
See, the way I see this is it's pulling the entire system like it's on a string, right? Because you pull on shift value and the entire system changes.
Well, okay. If that's the case, I would think that it should influence. God, why do I can't quite click on the right thing. This shouldn't be this hard to go ahead and click on. All right, okay. So in terms of my first comment was that any loop has to have a stock in it someplace. And all of them in the project do except this one. And after kicking it around for a while with Brian, I came to the conclusion that shift value system, education is what ends up shifting the value system so that the education is listed here as though it's an activity. Activity which provides the members of the community with the benefits of migrating toward local sustainable food system. And it shouldn't be an activity, it should be the level of education. Let me sort of do this model in terms of providing a sense of the way that I think about this. If I have rain, all right, rain is not raining as an activity, but rain as an entity. Rain actually adds to the lake level, okay? Well, so rain causes the lake level to increase. The lake level in conjunction with the sun, produces water vapor. The water vapor in conjunction with temperature change, in the appropriate manner. Does this diagram make any sense?
Yes.
So that the, and this isn't right either. This should just be temperature. So with a given amount of water vapor, if the temperature decreases, it's likely to end up producing rain. So all of the entities, elements should be noun or noun phrases, non-directional. So we don't talk about increasing rain or increasing lake level or whatever. What happens to the entity is defined based upon the relationships that interact with it. And I find that on an ongoing basis, I have to come back to a simple model like this to get me to remember not to put activities in the structure, so that education as we have it currently is an activity as opposed to the level of education. There is something that is responsible for increasing the level of education, but I don't think it's on the diagram at the moment.
Yeah, I see education as a derivative of the value system, because we educate ourselves on what we value. And there are influence factors on the value system that are outside of this current schematic. So, for example, it's a social system. Yeah, I'm just in a discussion with the regeneration movement there about how it's a future of food article that came out, and it's based on a study that was done by McKinsey, where the food system, the food industry, is basically seeking to continue to perpetuate a form of industrial agriculture that reduces the impact on the environment, but continues to deliver inputs that they need for their current business models. So that's one side. So what they're doing, for example, is they're taking seed and they're coating the seed with pesticides and fertilizers already. So by the time they insert the seed into the ground, it's already protected with herbicides and insecticides. That is not regenerative agriculture, because it still doesn't allow the microbiota in the soil to evolve and develop. So it's not regenerative organic. So the Regeneration International and the 4 per 1,000 initiative is seeking to completely naturalize the system and allow nature to build up its own defense systems, which is 10,000 years of agriculture. So these are two diametrically opposed ideas about how the future of agriculture is about to unfold. This is really in the process right now. So the imperative, the strategic imperative of the food industry is to maintain their business models, meaning they have to have standardized inputs into a vertically integrated supply chain. So you couldn't have McDonald's, for example, operate in a decentralized agricultural system. Whereas so unless that imperative changes to say priority is sequestration of carbon into soil, then that in turn would shift the entire system towards where we are going here. But it's currently not happening, and it's bound to not happen if the industry continues on its current path. Does it make sense? So the value system that drives the entire development of what is a rural community system, what can it be? What is it allowed to be?
So what is it that causes the value system to evolve? Presently, it has only one input, which is education.
if the change in the entire system.
Yeah, I see education as an output, not as an input to it. I mean, eventually, education will come back because it will inform values, you know, but values are predetermined on what is their intention, what is the intention of the system, what is the aim of the system.
The overall intention of the system.
Yes.
Gene, you made a number of balancing loops for this system, and when I look at them as being transformational for the entire system, and that all those balancing loops need to be occurring at the same time for the overall transformation to work to what Klaus is saying. It's not going to be a piecemeal thing. It's going to have to be an overall transformation. And I also see education as being a formal process as opposed to formal mental models, as opposed to informal mental models, which make up public awareness, which is affecting ecology, which is affecting community health, which is affecting local governance.
Well, like on that line, what Gene defined education as the education level,
Right.
the level is kind of a quantity rather than a value that is embedded within that education grade. So yes, I'm agreeing with Brian on that. I don't know if I'm saying it in the right way.
Yeah, just an added thought here that I think that education is also driven by our value system. And I agree that education provides us the processes that also help mold that value system into the system itself. So it's just like it's all looping back together. So I think the key here is one of the readings that I saw is, first, I guess my question is, how do we equate value system with culture? Because there's a reading that I saw that in order to affect culture, one of the most important thing is processes. So I guess alongside that question is, if culture equates with our value system, then which processes do we need to kind of infuse here in order to mold it? And that processes is also, driven by educational level and, the entire, the pedagogy that goes with it.
One of the approaches I took when looking at this system was using the old Midyar group's classification of the elements into transactional, structural, and attitudinal. And right now, I see education under this system being mostly transactional, because it's not cohesive enough between the ecology and the community health and the governance and all the other aspects of it, especially not into affecting the mental models of general public awareness. And so that's what I use for my classification. The processes are transactional at this point, but they're not firm enough to really be systemically structural.
So what do I do with that?
Right now, I don't think there's much we can do about it. I think we're going to have to think about it. I mean, I'm playing around with the other map I created with the relevant factors map, and trying to bring out some ideas. But I think we're getting to the point where these ideas are becoming emergent. It's not just a matter of cause and effect and figuring one step to another step. It's more like, what is the entire system doing?
It is what the entire system is doing, though the entire system is a synthesis of the individual relationships, right? So that you can't say that the value system is the result of a bunch of stuff that's not on the diagram.
Well, I think the value system is because a lot of what's on the diagram. You just have to go through the entire loop to get there.
Well, you can go through the entire loop as much as you want, but the only thing that currently influences the value system is education. In terms of the way that we have added the relationships, okay?
The only thing that directly influences it, maybe you don't have enough connections, but we have secondary influences. We move further down the pathways.
So
There are things that influence. All right.
my recommendation would be to create a link to value system to to its own sphere, because we're modeling a complex adaptive social system.
We actually have something like that, because Klaus, remember, we made a connection between value systems and implications.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think to arrive at values, we need to model the social interactions that shape values.
Okay.
Yeah, and
We want
so
to do a separate map then.
right, so there is a separate uh, 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 web of connections that lead to values, which then drive this entire model that we have set up here now.
It's though it's not a separate web of connections.
Okay.
It's an additional set of connections,
Right.
but it's not a separate set of connections.
No, it's not a separate. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking.
So it's an additional, but it's a single link.
Right.
So the two systems have one single connector from value system to the shaping of values. How does that happen?
Okay. The balancing loops that were recently provided all have this link going from implications to value system.
Okay.
I see this as being the link, which does kind of like what Klaus is saying, but I can agree with, maybe making that more formal or, developing that more. But the idea was, to me, is that the entire system results in implications. Those implications define where the system is at that point in time. That decides whether or not the value systems we could talk about are at a point of transformation, are at the tipping point where there's change. Right now, with what Klaus talked before about what businesses are doing, it's not at a tipping point. It's going to stay the same. What do we need to do in order to make that tipping point occur?
Okay.
So if I may just respond to that, Brian, when you say implications, right? When you think about having an intention to change the system, you're prototyping ideas, right? Because there's no way you can shape a plan and make it work in this level of complexity. So as you're prototyping ideas based on your values, you realize that there are implications on your actions which have to reinform the system.
Yes.
Right? So that is this internal loop.
Right.
But the starting point really is the intention of the system, which is based on your value structure, which comes from outside this loop. It has its own logic.
But then we're getting into the difference between the system as it exists now and then what we want the system to be. And right now, I'm dealing with the system as it is now, but I agree completely, in order to change it, we're going to have to put something in there to move it in that direction.
Okay. So at this point, go ahead, Bob.
I like what just happened, and the point being what Klaus had talked about of being aware of a business model different. I would say that was a transformational change in the moment of thinking of education in a different way for this project. So that's kind of like a culture for me of the group that is a value system that is hard to convey without telling the story together or rephrase or going through that information within a duration of time, which was referred to earlier. The transformational changes that happen in doing this are irreversible for the participants. Whatever that's worth.
Okay. Hello, Veronique.
Oh.
We have a new person. Hi. I just noticed that you showed up.
I haven't been here for a while, so I was just listening in to see where the team was going with it.
In the midst of our confusion, our evolving confusion. So at this point, do we make education a level? Is it the level of education that, as the level of education increases with regard to the rural community food system that we're talking about, public awareness increases, and as public awareness increases, it actually continues to evolve the level of education, and it's a reinforcing structure?
So education becomes a stock?
I think so.
I think so too. I agree.
Okay, so we'll make this a stock.
I say the same thing is true of value system.
You said the same thing is true for what?
Value system.
Yes. Now, that being the case,
Oh, 06 becomes a loop. It grew up and became a loop.
and when I reload, it'll end up in the right place in the sequence. So,
Take out the wording too.
say again?
Take out the wording under the description.
We'll go back and fix it. One of us will. So, and as the value system evolves in a direction that's consistent with what it is that we're attempting to develop, the education level increases, and that increased education level also influences the value system.
Yes.
And we have a reinforcing structure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So is there a direct influence on education other than public awareness and value system? Presently, those are the only two influences on education.
In terms of this system, I would say no. Education could be defined by its own system. No. But in terms of this system, I don't think so.
Yeah, education here is transactional. I mean, when you think about within agriculture, the way it is conceived today, all the universities are educating their students, educating farmers, working on science projects that support the existing paradigm created by the value system that wants to see agriculture happen in exactly this way. So if you change the value structure, then education will have a different mission. So it will shift direction. So it is completely dependent on the value system, but then education becomes reinforcing these values because now we go down that path of pursuing a specific intention.
Okay. And then is there anything else that ought to be added as a direct influence to the value system other than implications?
So on education, isn't there a resource issue too that impacts level of education?
Can you elaborate a bit more?
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of, and this has to do with value systems too, of course, but in terms of availability of resources that people can actually apply towards education.
Systems thinking has the same problem. There are enough systems thinking classes in universities.
Say it again, Brian.
Systems thinking has the same problem. There's not enough educational opportunities in high schools and grade schools and other places for it to really take hold.
So do you want to include something on the map?
Does it tie in anywhere on the rest of the map? That
Resource levels?
yes.
No.
I think that's more of an educational system issue rather than this issue for this map. And I'm trying to figure, the resources applies to every element on here. We don't have enough production capability. We don't have enough community health. We don't, I have a hard time figuring how to do that.
But that in itself is also a values problem, right? So there's a mentality of abundance that you can have with those things, or you can have a mentality of scarcity. See that there's not enough. So maybe it ties into value systems more than anything else.
Yeah, I would argue that education will get the resources it needs depending on the existing value structure. When you look at the Farm Bill, for example, it's a $1 trillion bill. The way the money in the Farm Bill is allocated is entirely derivative of current value structures, right?
Yeah, that's true in the US. I'm thinking more about Ghana. So if we're keeping it to US, then that definitely is true.
So my thought would be that a shift in the value structure has to really start by those groups that control the political and economic system. So how does one influence values in that drive $1 trillion economy, a global economy, really? And what are the influence factors to change that thinking that currently prevails?
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on that, Klaus. I think one of the biggest influencer in terms of changing the value system is actually the needs, because from the needs, this is where policies are being driven. So I think the basic needs of the society is the biggest influencer from my perspective.
That's a good point. So the needs of the food system are, first of all, food security, baseline. They are now driven by climate change considerations, ecological destruction. They are driven by profit motives. They're driven by the desire to control the control market. I think so. Those are probably the core issues. So values is almost misleading because it's just hardcore issues of market dominance, competitive considerations. In addition to providing basic food security yeah, I think I'm sort of trolling off here.
Right.
Yeah, but don't forget the social needs that everybody has too, right? So values are shaped more by interactions of the type that we're having right now than anything else, probably. And this is all about how humans work together and interact with each other.
Yeah, that's, I mean, social needs, definitely, cultural needs and community needs, definitely is also a block, but looking at existing power structures, it is one area that is not being dominant. The dominance is in the profit motive, in the markets, in a competitive market environment, wanting to the need to control. It is linked to the current supply chain models that require very specific input levels. That mean industrial agriculture is feeding an entire supply chain that is vertically integrated and interdependent, complementary, really, in the way that has been set up. You wouldn't have McDonald's, 34,000 restaurants, if it wasn't for Monsanto and Tyson and Cargill.
Right. Yes, and what you also see right now is that some of those value systems are getting to a point that a lot of people are no longer comfortable with them. So you see pockets of change everywhere, be it in this roundtable of CEOs issuing a letter that they no longer are solely concerned with profits, or just the fact that we're having this conversation right now.
So people are becoming no longer comfortable with them. Why is that? Because their level of education has increased, their own awareness of the implications of those systems has evolved.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think of it as the marshmallow situation, that if I'm hungry, I'm going to eat that marshmallow, but the cultural power of reframing it into a duration where the whole culture can thrive over a long periods of time requires me to have a value system that can appreciate the complexity to refrain from just eating the marshmallow right away. So that comes from that reference to culture, I think, of how we're framing our value system so that we just don't eat marshmallows.
And I think just to support the other gentleman's statement here about the tipping point, I guess once we create traction based on those new needs now, and the public or the society is clamoring for something, then that could be the start of some significant change.
Yeah,
there's some sort of stacking there. Yeah.
Right, it's a hierarchy. Yeah, so if we look at Donella Meadows, the leverage, the points of leverage in a system, it's a hierarchy, right? I mean, she has 10 or 12 points there, and it ends up in change the story if you want to change the system. And so the energy right now really has to be in shaping a value system that then drives the food system. So the energy has to be there. So I see a lot in the discussions that I have with like the Sierra Club and the Sunrise Movement and these groups there. Now they're focusing on minute components within the system. How do we get regenerative agriculture going? Well, that is just going against the prevailing power streams and bound to be a minor sideshow unless they can step back and engage in the value structure, which then will drive this massive system. So this has been my point of contention, is step outside of this loop now and talk about how do we shape a value system that then enables the formation of a local community system.
So though that discussion gets into the same problem we seem to have on an ongoing basis in terms of this, what we're trying to represent now is how are the relationships currently working to cause the system to be the way it is, as opposed to this is what we have to do to make it be different than the way it is. So that Klaus's comments about you have to do this to change the value system so the whole system will change. Well, yes. Presently, what is it that's causing it to be the way it is and not change?
So whose value system are we talking about mostly, right? So you have a society at large, which might drive everything else, but there might be people within this food system that are more important than others. So let's talk about farmers for a second. And when they have a particular value system that seems highly relevant to this local food system here, and there's definitely movements within the farming community that are moving towards more sustainable and local food production. So where did those values come from?
That's all right. Yeah, when I realised the order in which you spoken, I quite often get inquiries that I just direct on without really reading this stuff.
There's another conversation happening in the background, I think.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. I will, yeah, turn that off, sorry.
I would say right now, the system we are looking at in front of us, basic defining value is economic. Not cultural, not ecological, not environmental, not community health. It is economic, and that it is competing against a industrial farming system, which is a Goliath to David without the slingshot.
Well, I would also present an argument that would depend on the competitive landscape and on the different players that are dominant right now, because it could be economic if the dominant players are mostly driven by, stakeholder value, producing all those stuff. However, from where I live here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I saw other players here that are more regional, and they remain to be private. And at the same token, they really have a strong orientation with the community. So what may drive the value system in some other areas may be different here in my area. But to your point, Brian, that might be a general consensus, and I'm just respectfully arguing here that could be different depending on where you are and what the competitive landscape is.
I hope so. I agree with you, and I hope so, because we need to have those points of leverage in order to develop the system further. But
Right.
I have to say right now, we are the Alamo, and we're under siege.
So the system isn't static.
No.
Even the way it is at the moment, it is evolving
Right.
to different extents in different places, depending upon the value system of the players in those locations.
But Roma, to come back to your point about economics, there are some of the people who've switched to regenerative agriculture have very successful businesses going on. And so isn't the question more about the economics, but the perception of economics instead of the actual economics?
I can see that, but one of the things when I'm looking at systems is I believe that the current systems we have are what I call entrenched, and they're far harder to change or alter than I believe most people think about, and that you have to have a tremendous amount of energy or leverage in order to change them. So I'm always concerned, when people, we live in bubbles, and when we work like this, we see, well, all the wonderful things are happening with regeneration, but I don't know if that's actually happening in the entire country, which I'm focusing on the United States here. are we really making the level of change necessary to affect the system the way we want to? And I'm not convinced that we are. I'm a pessimist.
I think, Brian, I have been seeing as well, wherein big businesses are kind of emphasizing more on social responsibility now, and I think that's a good shift.
I
And
hope
it's
so.
probably a shift towards to more of businesses serving the people rather than, you know, focusing on just plainly the economic side of it. I'm
So,
hoping.
well, I agree with that, Romer, and the idea that would it be possible to change value system to value systems? Because it seems like all of us we're playing within the value systems of multiple situations in every moment almost. That you know, in order to survive in, you can have a local appreciation, but you got to make the economics drive the situation that I got to play in a bigger game in order to put have the farm survive. And so it's always multiple value systems that are going on within everyone.
I'm okay with that.
Well, I agree with that, Bob. And I guess the argument that we first presented here is more on the philosophy that when the business is geared towards or is more focused on its impact to the society, the financial aspect of it follows. I mean, because there will be a need for that. So I guess that's the philosophy behind it. So to your point, Bob, the financial part of it, the economic side of it, is also, you know, a point well taken.
Right, and if we have that value systems, then you end up with well, the bigger players or the ones with more money, they're following those values because it drives how they frame their businesses also. So by making it a multiple value systems rather than just one concrete game that this is the way it all is played, that maybe creates more dynamics for everything to change within a period of time.
I suspect it's going to work the same way as temperature. It's going to be an average of kinetic energy or an average of moral energy.
Yeah, depending on who's framing that area of temperature. Right.
Then whose value system is this?
Well, that's my point. Yeah.
Well, it's a collage. I mean, it's culture. Maybe that's what you end up with, a value system that drives culture, which is a collage of multiple inputs. I mean, for example, what Bob was just saying, you could take the social system, social justice considerations, employment, you know, income, and community health impacting as one value system. Then you can take the corporate structure, profit motive, but basically corporate considerations. Well, that is influenced by considerations regarding your business model, you know, perpetuation of your existing supply chain, things that will be counter to social justice issues, for example, or to environmental concerns. You know, then environmental concerns is another stream that has multiple inputs, which then shapes a consensus opinion about itself. So all of these have to stream together into one point, value systems, which then drive how that will translate into this community food system that we are trying to define.
Right. And I would argue that if you want to keep the status quo, the more you want to avoid this discussion of complexity of values, like you just said, Klaus. You want to make it, well, at least we know the value system for our food system. This is the way it is. Let's not get involved in these complexities of all these other things. And so the more that we get that discussion that we're doing, the more likely there is to be a change.
Could you replace value system with something else that's less amorphous?
Whichever way you express it, it's meant to be a driver, right? I mean, what we have sitting there right now, value system, is a collection of values that come to a consensus that drive the system.
Well, though.
So what about narrative, Gene? So, and I'm thinking about other values that have been changed recently, fairly rapidly, like on gay marriage is a good example, for instance. The public opinion just shifted dramatically over the last 30 years. And a lot of that had to do with that the framing and the narrative around this issue changed significantly.
Okay, though those, there are specific things that have changed slowly for a long period of time and then very rapidly all at once, as soon as they hit the tipping point.
Right.
Though, and they're specific when you talk about gay marriage and the war on smoking in public in lots of places where people used to smoke, but they don't smoke anymore. I don't know, there are others. And they are all the result of a changing value system on the part of the participants. Though there's a value, I think it was mentioned, there's a value system for the individuals who are better off consuming local. But then there's a value system for the large industrial providers. There's a value system for the distributors. I mean, there are multiple value systems at play within this environment. I think the value system that we're referring to here is the value system of the individual consumer.
Yeah, I would say that's the dominant force.
The individual consumer value system, which when it changes to a sufficient extent, it drives the change of the rest of the environment.
Now, only if there's enough information, though, right?
Right. I mean,
yeah, it depends on information and it depends on control, because I mean, the consumer, the individual consumer, is so dependent on the information system. Look at advertising, look at the entire environmental messaging that's coming at the consumer. I mean, consumers who don't understand what is climate change don't understand why regenerative agriculture is an issue. You know, so and the information, the same companies that control the food business also control the media. You know, there's 6 corporations, multinational corporations, control 90% of US media. So you're not going to change anything in the individual consumer markets if if the corporate world doesn't decide to change course and send different messages into the market.
There's an issue here, though, that I realized with the other map that I created, not the one I did on the area, and that is all the balancing loops that we created recently, go through local production. None of the balancing loops, none of the transformational changes, loops that we did, I consider them transformational changes, through local consumption. You all go through local production. Local consumption is really not relevant to changing consumer values the way this map is set up in its current configuration.
I think it's tempting to think that we can view this as a few monolithic value systems, but let me suggest that there can be multiple value systems in one individual at the same time.
true.
I'll go back to 1980. My father built a confinement hog house for mother sows to give birth to their pigs rather than roll over on them and kill them, which really would reduce your profitability. But he started to develop symptoms of lung cancer, even though he had never smoked tobacco in his life or been in really harmful circumstances that much. But it was because of the dust and the methane inside the building, which started to give all of us a clue about the toxicity of the system. So that's why I'm saying there can be multiple value systems in one individual, or even that system of individuals. I'll venture to guess that there are large, very large family farms bordering on industrial farming methods who would say to you, yeah, I agree about the stuff I'm doing, the pesticides, the herbicides, but here I am at this place in the value chain and I'm locked in, man.
Yeah, which is bringing us back to the point of using this value stream as the core lever of the entire system.
So yes, there can be multiple value systems. The one that's most relevant to this environment that we're trying to understand is the consumer value system, which ends up being the driver to education, to public awareness, to the desire for local food. And it's the desire for local food that drives local production. So that, you know, with the producers aren't going to produce local unless they believe that there's a desire for local food. You know, it's not, I don't think it's a push, I think it's a pull.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with this consumer value system, because the consumer is so influenced by education, and education in turn is so influenced by value system. You know, as I was saying before, I mean, the universities, all the universities, extension services in the US teach industrial, chemically intensive agriculture. You know, that's the value that has been injected into the system. And they, you know, in turn, educate the consumer on, don't worry about sugar, there is no medical proof that it causes diabetes. I mean, you know, you have the entire messaging driven by the core value system, which is set up by this fear that we talked about outside of it. The consumer is actually quite helpless within this system.
Okay, so so which value system is it that should be here on the map?
Systems value system.
The what?
The systems value system.
You're making me very ill.
Like I said, it's temperature. You're taking the temperature, the value temperature of the entire system.
But still, we're coming back to when value systems change, right? There's always powerful forces to keep things in place, but there are also powerful forces to change values. And so the undeniable effects of climate change is one of them. The health effects that are experienced by workers in the fields is another one. And there's so there are some real effects that are playing out that do impact how values are being shaped at the end of the day.
System is looking for some form of equilibrium. We actually have two systems. We're only talking about one here. We're talking about the regenerative sustainable food system. The industrial food system, though, also is trying to reach equilibrium, trying to maintain itself in its current form and not be affected by what we're trying to do here. So I think that, I'm going to lose my train of thought. Okay, I'll come back to it. I mean,
You should make shorter trains of thought.
I know, but this is getting too many.
What you're saying is there are multiple systems that are interdependent, that create interdependencies.
Right.
What we are looking at here, what we have created so far, is actually like the final stage of this complexity. So preceding for a local rural community food system to be able to function in the way that we envision this here requires changes upstream.
Yes.
And so we are talking specifically about systems values. What are the systems values? A composite of influence factors, that shape into a common direction, which is then expressed in systems values, which then drives the entire system through education, through public media, through policies, regulations, and so on that enable the system to take place. None of it will happen until the upstream value system changes.
Thank you.
Right. But the drivers for any change in value systems are the needs of people versus what's reality in the world, right?
In reality, that should be the case. However, there was a discussion around wherein major players can influence awareness and education. And with their desire to protect the status quo, then there comes some conflict of interest there, which is another force. So having said this, I think it is also critical to probably zoom in a little bit into the competitive environment and identify those players. So the thought is segmenting it into a simpler form so we know who the influencers are, and then we can identify levers on how to affect the system. So for example, looking at, there's one area here, competition from large providers, which is a negative effect on local production. If we try to zoom in into the competitive landscape, this is not the only force. You are also talking of regional players and smaller players who has a positive effect into the local production. Now you're talking of three segments here: the large providers, medium scale providers, and the small scale providers. And from these three segments, the large scale provider seems to be a negative effect, but the other two could be the positive influencers for this system. Now, knowing these three categories, I guess this would look back to the local government, partly on how they would affect change. How would they incentivize the smaller players in order to stay active in the community? And also, this will look back into the various business models that they have, knowing that our financial system, we are in a capitalist model here. So these publicly traded companies, who happen to be mostly the large providers, they are really, they have different incentives. They are really gearing towards, I would say, I would hypothesize or assume, more on the economic side of it. They look for efficiency, they look for lower cost. While the smaller scale providers or the regional providers, just like what I've seen here in my own little world here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it doesn't seem like they're just driven by profit, but they put back whatever they have back into the community, and that's very evident here in my localities. So I guess going back to my point is zooming in more into the competitive landscape. we will be able to gain more insights and perspectives and really dig a little bit deeper into what we could do about it.
Okay, so Romer, did you talk about something that actually influenced these two?
Yeah, one thing that jumped into my head would definitely be how the local or maybe the national government responds to the landscape. How do they balance it? Because right now, I think in my location here, as I've mentioned, I think there's a healthy balance of competition here. We have Costco's in the area, we have Walmart's, and we also have a regional player here who seem to be thriving, which is, I'm not sure if you folks are familiar with Meyer. And it looks like that we have a very good competition here that really benefits the consumers. We have more foods on the table because depending on the niche market that they're serving, people can have various options. And if they're very cost sensitive, then they could opt to somebody else. And at the same time, our local production here, our farmers here are also well supported because every time I go to one of our regional grocery here, I would only buy apples that really came from my local farms here. And it is something. I mean,
So Romer, you want a link from here to here?
I'm not. Is it possible, Gene? We kind of put an outer circle on medium and small providers at the same, encompassing the large providers as well, just like a dotted circle.
No.
No. Okay. So yeah.
I wish I could. I've talked to him about that several times, but
okay.
So you want one from local governors to large providers also?
Yes, I think that would be representative of the relationship.
And does it promote or diminish?
It varies. I don't know about with the other local governments, so I guess it varies. This is highly political in nature. In my area here, I could probably assume that they are maintaining a good balance here in terms of placing the right barrier to entry.
But does the local government diminish the competition from large providers, or does it promote it?
It protects. It should protect.
It should protect. Yeah. It diminishes probably the right. Yeah. Yes. Class.
Regulation, land use, zoning laws, and so.
Yeah.
Mind you've got another element someplace, which is policies that skew the system, either way. Also, are we talking about local governments, or are we talking about federal and state governments? I don't think local governments have all that much influence right now, which is why I made it weak, through incentives. I don't think there's a direct correlation or a connection between competition from large providers and local government or medium. I think it's indirect.
What do you mean indirect?
I mean, like we have before, local government goes to incentives, which could be financial or policy or whatever, which goes to local production. But this, I'm not seeing it.
You're not seeing this?
I'm not seeing this or the other one.
Okay.
Well, let me just jump in for a moment. Like here in Bend, Oregon, for example, they don't allow McDonald's, for example, to set up shop in downtown. They don't want any chain operations within the downtown district. So no spaghetti factory or Olive Garden or what have you. They are put out to the periphery into shopping malls. So local government does have indeed quite some impact. local
Okay.
government determines farmers markets, for example.
Individual businesses, but we're saying something more here. We're saying local government has an overall defining role on competition from large providers. And I think that's actually more federal and state than it is local. I mean, if you want to change it to government awareness, that's okay, you can see that, but not local.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, obviously, we have to come back to the beginning of the system, you know, maybe where we go back to values, education. But another big loop then, of course, is policies. I mean, policies drive everything, drive the entire system.
Yeah.
But policies are based on values.
There's
So
all the elements.
the Farm Bill, as it is currently conceived, is a complete disaster. I mean, it just promotes industrial agriculture. So those are policies and regulations. So I think that's where the national policy comes in, and we haven't really put anything in for that.
We're also focusing on economics with the discussion we're having right now, about talking about the balance of proper competition and the consumers are getting a price level which they can work with and so forth. But we were looking before about the system affecting community health and affecting the environment. I mean, we may be having an economically fine industrial farm system, which is creating cheap products, but is it also creating environmental damage, which is one of the things we wanted the system to change.
Right. So Gene, what we may have to do is shift value system back and put into its place national policies and regulations, which are driven by the value system, and then which flow into the entire system.
Okay, so what am I supposed to do with these two at the moment?
I'm sorry, my vote is get rid of them. I mean, it should be democracy, but my vote would be to get rid of them.
Yeah, I do think local government has a role, but it is downstream. No, it's tactical local. Yeah.
Yes.
So what do you want to do with this?
Pull it back and then replace it with, make it its own box, and then replace it with federal policies and regulations.
You want federal policies and regulations, not right here, you want them to influence that, right?
No, federal policies and regulations drive the entire system, really.
You want that here?
Oh, there's an element called policy at the very bottom of this system. There's a policy right there. Policy influences that.
Skew the system.
Right. That's
okay.
Where the federal should be.
Yes.
Yeah, but these policies are derivatives of the value system that is being deployed here.
So we need to find some way of tying those two together. Either indirectly through an entire system, which this kind of does, though I'm not quite sure how. Because everything ends up with implications at some point in time. The whole thing works out the implications to the value system. So everything here affects the value systems.
So do you want this to influence implications, which would then influence the system's value system?
No, because I think if you look where it's going to now, it goes to two different directions.
Local consumption and local production.
And then from there, it goes through the entire system to go back to implication.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
The point is not informed by those two points.
Okay.
We just have to do federal here in order to definitively say, I mean, I got a federal system. I got Joe Biden's proposed farm policy there.
So did you want to make this federal?
How about we make it state and federal?
Do what?
State and federal.
Okay. And you want that to influence this?
Oh, we can do that.
Huh?
I think it's already doing it, just indirectly. I'm not quite sure it's that strong to be direct.
I think it's the other way around.
Yeah.
Oh, this okay. Reverse the connection. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, I can see that. Yeah. Through elections and so forth. All right.
Okay. We're at 13 minutes after, and I would like to give Romer and Veronique a little bit of an overview of what's here and what they might do before we get cut off. That's okay? Okay. So
Great. Thank you.
So we've been at this since 7.2, and it's sort of been a lot of trial and learning, and different people are contributing at different levels. Anybody with a Kumu username and password can come in here and go to issues and actually comment on any of the issue threads that currently exist. All right, and there are a few of them. Fortunately, we have 23 of them we've finally closed, but 34 of them are still open. So you can read through them and add comments to them. You can also start new issue threads on any aspect of the project that you have questions or concerns or don't understand. If you want to go to another level, one of a couple of levels, you can actually become observers or contributors. And the advantages to that are, if you're an observer or a contributor, the project knows you so that it will keep track of you actually becoming a member of one of the issue threads. So if anything else gets posted to that issue thread, you will get an email. And if people create new issues, you will get an email. When you come back to the project, it will tell you how many issues there are that you haven't read. You also can, if you're either one of the observer or contributor, you can click an entity such as this, go here and say comment, and it will initiate a discussion thread on that particular entity and affix an asterisk to it. That's what all these asterisks are all over the place, so that you can actually get to the issue thread that was already started on that particular issue. Additionally, we're using something called what? What was it called? I forget. Called Showcase. So all these dots along the bottom, because it's hard to see what's what, this will unfold this project loop by loop. And you don't have to have multiple installed, but you can go across here and say, all right, where's 11R? 11R doesn't work for some reason. There's 12R. Brian, what do we do with 11R?
Now, when we change the name.
We're, all right, and you can go ahead. You can, sorry. Any aspect of this project that you want to look at in detail, you can click and hold and it will focus on that particular element. There are a lot of different things in here that work. We implemented, Brian has been writing a lot of comments on all of the elements, which I really appreciate. If you mouse over things, it does pop-ups. So it will give you a description of that particular element because a lot of them are too small to read. All right, so it'll give you the title and let you actually scroll through. Stop.
Cool.
All right, and we've actually created a whole set of videos about all of the various and sundry pieces of this that we have figured out how to do in this context, so that if you, and that's right in the project itself. So in terms of members, you can come here and you can watch a video about being members and the advantages of being a member, or of how to create elements and connections and loops and all of the different pieces. So it's sort of a set of crib notes on using Kumu if someone comes here and isn't familiar with Kumu to begin with. So all of those things are here in the project. Since you got here, the email that got you here gave you a link to where this project is to begin with. And we encourage people to actually interact, fix things, break things, learn some more. And we're sort of figuring out how to go about this. But we've tried to create a set of enough breadcrumbs so that somebody can figure out how we got here, and help us continue to move forward. So I know that's Federal Express introduction, but if you have an initial question, I'll go ahead and try and answer it. Or if you...
Yeah, with regard to those labels, 14R, 18R, what's the significance on that?
Well, they're reinforcing and balancing loops.
Okay.
And we changed, they used to be labeled such and such, R, number B, but because of the way that Kumu has the ability to do showcasing, this structure along the bottom is built automatically. So if we add another loop and reload the model, it'll just add additional dots to the bottom. We don't have to we don't have to build this manually. The other thing that's cute, really nice, is you can go here and say, oh, 7R, and it will focus on 7R. And then if I go back here and say 06 and select that one, now I'm focused on the two of them together so I can look at them. So, I mean, it's a real usable environment, though it takes a bit of getting used to because it has so many capabilities in it. And if the two of you already have Kumu usernames, if you'll email them to me, I'll go ahead and set you up in the project.
Thank you.
And you can be dangerous just like all the rest of us.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
Question about the connection we just made.
So say that again.
A question about the connection we just made, going from value systems to policy.
This one.
That one. What's the strength of that connection?
One thing to think of the value of that would be some of the discussion about competition and cooperation. It seems like policy and value system, at least formally, forms the rules of the game. And as there's an assumption that there is some cooperation of all the players within that, and then they can be competitive within that setting. So the idea of policy framing the game so that all the players can be competitive in a non-destructive way is one of the roles, I think, of policy. So that then becomes a very strong lever point. If you can change the policy, you can change the dynamics of the things we've been describing.
Big if. I think it's weak.
You do?
I think what we're talking about here is the consumers, the body politic and the influence it has on federal and state governments. And if it has much fluence as we were hoping for, we wouldn't see all the crap we're seeing right now.
Right, yeah, well, I'm not saying.
Yeah, but somebody said that the systems value system was sort of the crux of the whole system and it influenced everything. But
It does.
but it's weak.
Now it ain't doing it the right way. We have not reached the tipping point yet.
Well, let's step back for a moment here. The policy making body, certainly in the United States, but in most other places, is really controlled by business. So what we see coming out of the Farm Bill, for example, I mean, that is what industry wants it to do. You know? And it absolutely influences the entire system. So think about Donella Meadows with her hierarchy of how to influence a system, right? So you're starting basically with paradigm, at the paradigm level, right? Which is where the debate is currently. It's at the paradigm level. You know, should we modify our agricultural systems so that they respond to the needs to mitigate climate change? Now, should we make climate change and a changing environment make the priority of what we need to respond to? That's a paradigm. Then that paradigm, once it's established, then it goes down several levels into the system. You know, the next step then is policies and regulations. The next step then becomes ever deeper levels of bureaucracy that work on the implementation, but it is a pyramid, yeah? And it's driven at the top level, which is the paradigm level. Okay. So and I think that you know, if you think about that paper that you wrote there about the leverage points of the system, I mean, it makes perfect sense for this. Yeah.
The paper is actually under loop 6.
Right.
And you've convinced me that it should be strong. That because the current system right now is based on economic market forces, it does have influence.
Right. But that reflects the values in society, right? So as much as we like to pretend otherwise, the current system reflects the value placed on those market forces.
Right.
Yes.
Good. I like it.
Good. In that case, we should stop.
We should create more confusion. Man.
Right.
You want to come back on Thursday?
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll send out another invite. And Romer and Veronique, thank you very much for showing up. Hope it wasn't too much of an overload all at once after missing the first 5 meetings. But yeah, I would encourage you to go wander around in the model and develop a little bit more of a sense of what's there, and that will definitely generate some thoughts about what ought to be changed, because it's not finished. It's not correct. It's a set of perspectives that we have meshed together through conversations such as this and the things that we did asynchronously. And the part of the intent was to figure out how could we do this without having to work in a synchronous mode only in online sessions such as this, so that people could actually go and work on it individually and not destroy each other in the process. So I mean, and since the last time I loaded this, somebody's made 9 new updates to this project. 3 of them were Klaus, and the rest of them were Brian's while we were discussing it. So to actually get them represented in what I'm looking at, I would just have to go ahead and reload it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm moved around here.
No, that's good.
Actually, I did all those before we started talking.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you all.
Okay, Gene, can you hold on a second?
What?
Can you hold on a second just between you and me?
Oh, sure. Okay. All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, all.
Gene.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Can I know I'm still here too. I won't listen to what you guys are talking about, but Brian, I didn't know if you had a moment to talk afterward.